this third exercise takes us a little away from ground rent calculations so much, and is an opportunity to reflect on its implications for the values of the various components, the partial interests, if you like, between the land, the improvements or the building, and the whole property. If you look at the beginning of this exercise, it looks very similar to the first exercise we did, and in fact it's really the same situation. The difference is what is required of the model, and that is to compute the property values, the partial interest values, and also the yields, and then we're going to have a little bit of a look at what they're actually telling us. And so to do this model, we'll just come down, and you'll notice that it looks very much like the first exercise, except that there's an extra panel down the bottom. Now, you can complete this exercise manually, and I'd probably recommend that so that you get a little bit of experience. However, I'm going to be a little bit lazy. I'm going to come down to the first exercise, which is based on, which just happens to be already completed. I'm going to borrow the mathematics there, copy and paste, and then I'm going to come back to the model we're working on at present, paste that in, and so that simply sets up the basic model. That gives us the ground rent calculation, also an idea of what the investor is expecting to earn every year in order to make the investment worthwhile. And so from that I can work out yields and values. Let's look at the whole property. I'm going to add an extra piece of data here, which is the yield on the whole property. And so to work out the value using capitalization, it's very easy. It's simply going to take the rent, all of these are assumed to be net by the way, and then divide that by the initial yield. I'm specifying initial yield because we are looking at present values, and as we go through with these models we find that present values and future values become very precisely considered. So here we're looking at present value, if you like, the initial yield. Okay, so if we capitalize the property rent, $2.95 million by 8%, we get $36.875 million for the property. We can do a similar thing to the building, at least in terms of working out what the effective yield is, because we're going to just import the agreed value of the building, so that's data, and now I'm going to calculate what that means in terms of yield, because up here I have the rent, if you like, the payment which the investor is going to require, at least before property growth starts to rear its ugly head. I'm going to divide that by the building value, and so that gives me 10.8%. And so what I can see here is that the building, if I consider it simply, rather than the discounting that we had to do to calculate all of this stuff in the first place, it looks like it's getting a simple yield of about 10.8%. Obviously with the growth and so on, that grosses up to equal the investor discount rate that we used in our initial computations. With these two values, we can now work out the value of the land by deduction. Now we have said in the notes that in the cases of partial interest, you remember from the last module, often there isn't a precise equation between the whole property, the value of the whole property, and the component parts being the building and the land. And while that's the case when we're looking at yields, when we're looking at the values, that tends to be a closer equation, and that's certainly what's behind the cost approach to valuation, and we're going to assume that here. So we're going to assume that the land can be thought of as simply the difference between the whole property value and the value of the improvements, so that's like a cost approach type of deduction to get the land value. Now I can work out the yield of the land because I have the ground rent, and I can divide that by the value of the land, and so that gives me an effective yield. Okay, so we have three numbers here. What are they telling us? First of all, this deduction here may not be totally precise, and so we have to take these observations with a little bit of a grain of salt. However, the overall lesson is the way that the yields work. And let's look at what's happening here. We can get the whole property yield by looking at comparable properties and the way that rents are working and all that sort of thing. So that can come from the market fairly well. We've seen that the building yield is really the result of fairly complex financial calculations based on the return that's required for the investor, and that's largely hanging off their discount rate. And so we get that. But you notice it's going to be higher. Now what's that telling us? It's saying that if I owned the whole property, I would have less risk and therefore less return than if I only owned the building. Now that's understandable when you realise that the land is considerably less risky than the building in most cases. And so in a typical stable, maybe mildly growing market, you would expect that the building, which is something that can be run into by aeroplanes, maybe burned down, maybe messed up by tenants or what have you, is fairly risky. However, the land is relatively bulletproof. It's going to be there no matter what. And as long as you have demand in a particular area, in a particular town or city, then you're fairly low risk. And so you would expect the building to have a higher yield than the land, and really the land to have the lowest yield of all three. In a way, the whole property's yield is a kind of average, not actually a precise average, but it's a combination of the risk and return characteristics of the building and the land. And so this is what we have coming out of our example here. We have the separation of the property into the improvements and then the land through the ground rent process, really separating out rent and return. And so the investor is taking a higher risk position and therefore expecting a higher yield, higher rate of return, whereas the landowner is on a very, very stable income. It's almost like money in the bank or government bonds or something, and so its return is quite low. This is a fairly important thing to dwell on. Give some thought to it. You can experiment with this model by perhaps changing this number. I'm going to change it and make it a little bit higher than the building yield. I'm going to see what happens. Oddly enough, that pushes the yield on the land really high. And so it's kind of almost the opposite of what we've been saying. Obviously, we have to keep this calibrated to the market. Let's go back to our 8% because that's a little bit more realistic. And what I'd like you to do is give some thought to what's going on here, because it can teach you a fair bit about investment property and the way that it works, and also helps you to understand the complications of working with land values.